He showed up to the most important job interview of his life in a pressed shirt and polished shoes, carrying a folder of documents that represented 3 months of desperation and hope. He was 7 minutes away from the building when the ground split open beneath the city, and in the chaos that followed, the screaming, the dust, the collapsing concrete, Marcus Reed made the kind of decision that can't be unmade. He chose to save a stranger instead of saving himself. He lost the interview. He lost the job. He nearly lost everything. What he didn't know was that the woman buried under that rubble was about to change his life forever. Marcet. If this story already has you hooked, hit that subscribe button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And stick with me through all 5 parts, because trust me, you don't want to miss where this one ends up. The tie was the problem. Marcus Reed stood in front of the bathroom mirror at 6:47 in the morning, pulling at the knot for the 4th time, watching it come out wrong again. Too wide at the bottom, crooked. He loosened it, smoothed the silk against his chest, and started over, pulling, folding, drawing the narrow end through the loop the way his uncle had shown him when he was 14 years old, standing in a motel bathroom in Jacksonville the morning of his grandfather's funeral. He hadn't worn a tie since the Navy. Hadn't had much reason to. "Daddy, you look weird." Marcus turned. Lily was standing in the bathroom doorway, still in her pajamas, the ones with the small yellow stars that she refused to let him wash more than once a week because she swore they lost their softness in the dryer. She was 8 years old, and she had her mother's eyes, dark and steady, the kind that made you feel like you were being evaluated, even when she was just deciding whether she wanted toast or cereal. "Good weird or bad weird?" Marcus asked. She tilted her head, considering. "You look like a teacher." "Teachers make good money," he said, turning back to the mirror. "Do they?" He didn't answer that. He finished the knot, still not perfect, slightly off-center, and decided it was good enough. He'd spent 45 minutes on it already. At some point, good enough had to be enough. The apartment was small, a 2-bedroom on the 4th floor of a building in the Whitmore district, a neighborhood that the city's development plans had somehow managed to skip over for the past 2 decades. The hallway smelled like the cigarettes of the previous tenant, and whatever the woman upstairs cooked every Tuesday night, the radiator knocked. One of the kitchen cabinet doors didn't close all the way, but it was theirs, or close enough to theirs, that it felt like something solid in a period of their lives that had been anything but. Marcus went to the kitchen and poured coffee into a chipped mug, blue, with the handle repaired by a thin line of dried superglue that he'd applied 3 weeks ago when Lily dropped it. He drank it standing at the counter, reading over the resume he'd already memorized. 2 pages. Navy service record. The demolitions and structural assessment training that qualified him for engineering-adjacent roles. The community college coursework he'd taken during the 2 years he spent not knowing what to do with himself. The gaps he'd tried to explain in ways that sounded like choices rather than collapses. He'd sent out 41 applications over the past 4 months. Apex Dynamics was the first company to call him back. The job was a field operations supervisor position, managing teams on large-scale structural projects, coordinating logistics, keeping things moving when things didn't want to move. The salary listed in the posting was more money than Marcus had made in any single year since he got out of the service. The benefits package included full health coverage, which meant Lily's asthma medication wouldn't require a separate calculation every month, the kind of calculation where he held a prescription bottle in one hand and his bank balance in the other, and tried to figure out which bill was the least dangerous to be laid on. He folded the resume carefully and slid it into the manila folder he'd bought specifically for today. Not the folder itself, he'd had it, but the clear plastic cover he'd bought to make it look more professional. $3.49 at the drugstore on Henderson. He remembered the exact amount because he'd checked his account balance before spending it. "Daddy!" Lily had appeared at the kitchen doorway now, still evaluating him. "I need to eat breakfast," she said. "We both do. You're not going to eat anything, are you? You always don't eat when you're nervous." "I'm not nervous." She gave him the look, the same expression her mother used to make when he said something that was technically not a lie, but was not exactly the truth either. "I'm concerned," he corrected. "There's a difference." What's the difference? Nervous is when you think something bad is going to happen. Concerned is when you're not sure yet. Lily considered this. Okay, you should still eat something. He made her oatmeal with brown sugar and cut half a banana into it the way she liked. Little circles laid out in a pattern because she'd once mentioned, offhand, barely paying attention, that she liked how it looked when he did it that way. He ate a piece of toast over the sink, he checked the time, he checked the folder, he checked the time again. The interview was at 9:30 a.m. Apex Dynamics' main building was 40 minutes away by bus, which meant he needed to leave by 8:40 at the latest, 8:30 if he wanted to arrive early and compose himself in the lobby before they called his name. Being early was a habit from the military that he'd never been able to shake, and today he was grateful for it. He had time. He was fine. He walked Lily to the end of the block at 8 o'clock, the way he did every morning when school was in session. She was in third grade at Carlisle Elementary, 6 blocks in the other direction, and she was old enough to walk with the crossing guard, but young enough that Marcus needed to see her cross the first intersection himself before he could feel right about the rest of the day. "You're going to get it," Lily said at the corner. She was looking up at him with that steady, unsentimental confidence of hers, the kind that only children can produce. Total certainty undiluted by experience. "Yeah?" Marcus said. "You're smart, and you know how to do stuff. That's what jobs want." He wanted to explain to her that it was more complicated than that the people interviewing him tomorrow would have piles of resumes from people who were also smart and knew how to do stuff, that the world had a complicated relationship with former military men in their late 30s who had spotty employment histories and no college degree. But she was 8, and she was looking at him like he was something solid. "We'll see," he said instead. He hugged her. She let him, which she didn't always, which she was growing out of, and she headed off toward the crossing guard with her backpack bouncing. He watched her cross. Then he turned and walked toward the bus stop. He was on the bus, 10 minutes into the ride, when the world came apart. There was no warning. That was the thing nobody told you about earthquakes. Not the ones Marcus had read about afterward. Not the news coverage with the dramatic footage and the expert commentary. Nobody properly communicated the way it happened without introduction. 1 second the bus was moving through morning traffic, the driver braking for a red light, a man 2 seats ahead reading something on his phone, a woman with grocery bags pressed against her knees. And then the ground moved. Not violently, not at first. It was more like the earth inhaled, a low subsonic shudder that Marcus felt in his chest before he understood what it was. The bus driver said something sharp and sudden. Then the second wave hit and the world turned violent. The bus lurched sideways, windows flexed. Marcus grabbed the seat rail as passengers slid and stumbled, bags falling from overhead, a woman crying out as she was thrown against the window beside her. Through the glass, Marcus could see the street doing things streets weren't supposed to do. Rippling, cracking, sections of asphalt rising and dropping in slow-motion heaves. A parked car jumped the curb. A traffic light pole swung sideways. Further down the block, the facade of a 5-story brick building began to peel away from itself in enormous chunks. Marcus was already standing. Not a decision exactly. His body made it first, the training wired into him across 11 years of service and 4 combat deployments reasserting itself below the level of conscious thought. He braced. He assessed. He registered the structural sounds around him, the deep cracking of load-bearing materials, the pitch of collapse differentiated from the pitch of settling. And he knew that the bus was not in immediate danger. The bridge 2 blocks ahead was a different story. The trembling lasted maybe 30 seconds. It felt like 5 minutes. When it stopped, there was a moment of absolute silence, the kind that follows catastrophe, a collective held breath, and then the sounds of the aftermath arrived all at once. Car alarms, someone screaming, a secondary rumble from somewhere underground, the hissing of a gas line, dust rising from the direction of downtown like a slow gray curtain. Marcus stepped off the bus through the front doors, which the driver had already opened. The air tasted different, mineral and sharp, the flavor of pulverized concrete. Around him, people were standing in the street, hands to their mouths, looking at their phones or looking at the skyline or looking at each other, not knowing what to do with themselves. He knew what to do with himself. He oriented. checked his body. He'd braced against the seat rail hard enough that his left forearm was already starting to ache, a deep bruise that would show up purple by evening, but nothing broken, nothing that mattered. He checked his watch. 8:52 a.m. The interview was in 38 minutes. The Apex Dynamics building was approximately a mile and a half north. The bus wasn't moving. Traffic had stopped in all directions. There were cars at angles, one with its hood crumpled against a fire hydrant. The road ahead had a crack running across both lanes. Not catastrophic, but enough that the driver wasn't going anywhere without instructions. Marcus could run a mile and a half. He'd done it in full combat gear on 3 hours of sleep in temperatures that made the city's summer feel like a mild inconvenience. In dress pants and dress shoes and a slightly off-center tie, with a manila folder under his arm, he could cover that ground in 20 minutes. He'd still be early. He was going to be fine. He started walking. Then he started moving faster. The sidewalk was covered in debris, chunks of decorative masonry, broken glass from storefronts, a stretch of metal awning that had detached and was lying across the pedestrian path. He navigated around it, picking his route, keeping the folder pressed against his chest. He was half a block from the bus when he heard it. Not a scream exactly. More like a voice coming from somewhere below the normal register of ambient sound, something struggling up through layers of material to reach the surface. He stopped, tilted his head. Listened the way he'd been trained to listen, filtering out the car alarms, the distant sirens, the sound of someone nearby saying, oh my God," into a phone. And there it was again. Someone calling for help, coming from his left, coming from the direction of what had been, approximately 90 seconds ago, the lower 3 floors of a parking structure. He turned. The building hadn't fully collapsed. What had happened was more specific and more chaotic. A portion of the lower eastern face had pancaked, the floors above it dropping at an angle, creating a compressed zone of debris at street level where concrete and rebar and interior materials had come together in a dense, unstable pile. The upper floors were still standing. The western side appeared intact, but the area where the voice was coming from was buried under approximately 2 meters of concrete slab and secondary material. He knew the math on this instantly, not just from training, though the training was there. The SERE courses, the Combat Rescue Operator certification he'd completed in his 3rd year, the live scenario exercises and simulated rubble. He knew the math because he'd lived it. He'd pulled people out of places like this. He knew how fast the body's reserve capacity depleted in crush situations, how quickly secondary collapse could follow primary collapse if you disturbed the wrong piece of the wrong load-bearing material, how much time you did and didn't have. He also knew he had 37 minutes until the most important job interview of his adult life. He stood there for exactly 2 seconds, not longer, not as long as it probably felt to him, and then he crossed the street. The voice was coming from a gap in the debris, roughly 3 feet wide and half that in height, where a concrete slab had come to rest at an angle against a section of intact flooring. Marcus crouched at the edge of it, looked in, and let his eyes adjust to the reduced light. A woman, lying on her back, one arm extended, the other pinned beneath a secondary slab. Not the main ceiling piece, but a smaller fragment that had come down on top of her during the collapse. Her face was cut, dust-covered, pale with shock. She was conscious. Her eyes found his, and something in her expression shifted. Not relief exactly, but recognition. The recognition of another person in a moment when you stop being sure that other people are real. "Hey," Marcus said. His voice was level. This was something he'd learned early in his service, that the voice was a tool, that calm was contagious in the same way panic was, and that the first thing a person in crisis needed to hear was a voice that didn't belong to the crisis. "I've got you. Can you tell me where you're hurt?" "My arm," she said. Her voice was thin, slightly disconnected, the particular quality of someone managing pain from a distance. "Something's on my arm. I can't move it." "I can see it," he said. "I'm going to take a look at the slab and figure out how we're going to move it. I need you to stay as still as you can until I tell you different. Can you do that?" "Yes," she said, and then, quieter, "Please don't leave." "I'm not leaving," Marcus said. He pulled his jacket off, yet the jacket that went with the interview outfit, the jacket he'd carried to the dry cleaner twice, and set it aside. He examined the slab. Maybe 400 kilograms, his mind estimated, accounting for the composition of the concrete and the fracture pattern at the edges. Not impossible. Difficult. There was a purchase point at the near corner where the edge had broken cleanly and he could get his hands underneath. If he could rotate it rather than lift straight, the mechanical advantage improved. The problem was stability. The slab above, the main ceiling section, was resting at an angle that depended partly on the smaller fragment remaining in place. Moving the fragment would shift the load. He needed to know whether it would shift toward the woman or away from her. He spent 90 seconds reading the structure. He looked at the angle of rest, the direction of the original collapse, the debris pattern around the edges. He didn't like everything he saw, but he liked better the alternative of leaving her there. "I'm going to need you to move toward me as soon as the slab shifts," he told her through the gap. "Can you use your legs?" She tried. He could see her shifting inside the gap. "Yes," she said. "I think yes." "Good. When you feel the weight come off your arm, you move. Don't wait to check if it hurts. Just move toward my voice, okay?" "Okay." He got his hands under the edge of the slab, pressed his back against the debris wall behind him for counterforce, set his feet against what felt like a stable section of broken flooring, and lifted. Every deployed injury he'd accumulated over 11 years of service woke up at roughly the same moment. His left shoulder, the one that had been separated in Fallujah and repaired imperfectly. His lower back, the forearm that had hit the seat rail on the bus, already bruising. He felt all of it. He lifted anyway. The slab moved. Not much, not easily, but it moved, rotating counterclockwise the way he'd calculated, the load shifting off the woman's arm toward the far side. Dust rained down from the ceiling gap. Something in the structure above them shifted with a sound that was not quite a crack and not quite a groan. "Now," Marcus said. He didn't shout it. He said it with exactly enough force to be heard and understood. "Move now." He heard her moving. He held the weight. His arms were shaking, not from weakness because he was still strong, but from the accumulation of the angle and the duration and the imperfect grip, the way maximum effort after age 35 felt different than it had felt at 22. He held it anyway. She emerged through the gap, pulling herself with her good arm, her legs pushing, scattering dust and debris chunks as she came. She was out. She was past the slab. She was in the light. Marcus set the slab down, controlled as he could manage, and dropped to one knee, catching his breath. His shirt was ruined. There was blood on his left hand from where the concrete edge had cut across his palm, and he hadn't noticed until now. His back was going to remind him of this for a week. The woman was sitting in the street, cradling her arm, staring at him. Her face was a complicated study in shock and pain and something else he didn't have a name for. "Are you okay?" she asked him, which struck him as the strangest possible question under the circumstances. "I'm fine," he said, which was mostly true. He straightened up, checked the street around them. The sirens were closer now. He could see the red flash of emergency vehicles 2 blocks away, working their way through the debris-cluttered street. He could see a group of first responders moving toward them on foot, someone with a medical kit over their shoulder. "There's help coming," he said. He pointed. "Those people, coming from the east. They'll have medical personnel. You need to have that arm looked at. Could be a fracture." "What's your name?" she said. He was already putting his jacket back on. The folder was still there, miraculously. He'd set it down before he crossed to the debris, and it had stayed put. He picked it up. He checked his watch, 9:04, 26 minutes. If he ran, if the road was passable, if nothing else stopped him. "Are you going to be okay until they reach you?" Marcus asked. "Yes, but who are you?" "Someone who happened to be here," Marcus said. The first responders were close enough now that he could see the cross emblem on the kit. Close enough. She was safe enough. He straightened his ruined tie. He tucked the folder back under his arm, and he turned and started moving north, toward Apex Dynamics, toward an interview that was now 25 minutes away, telling himself that he could still make it, that everything was still possible, that this morning could still end the way he'd promised Lily it might. He had no idea what was already broken. not in the city, in his plans. In the future, he'd mapped out so carefully in a two-bedroom apartment with a radiator that knocked and a cabinet door that didn't close. He just kept walking. He made it 4 blocks before he knew. Not the kind of knowing that arrives with evidence. No phone call, no official word, no one telling him directly. It was the city that told him. The city, in the state it was in at 9:07 on a Tuesday morning after the ground had tried to shake itself apart, was not a place where a man in dress shoes and a blood-stained shirt could move in a straight line at any useful speed. The road north was blocked at the corner of Fillmore and 9th, where a section of an older apartment building had shed its entire upper facade onto the street below. Not a small amount of material. Marcus estimated it at a glance the way he'd been trained to estimate things, quickly and without sentiment. Hundreds of tons of brick, mortar, and interior structure spread across both lanes and most of the sidewalk, in pieces ranging from the size of a shoebox to the size of a compact car. A city maintenance truck had tried to pull forward before the collapse finished and was now buried to its windshield in debris. The driver was out, standing 10 feet away with his hard hat pushed back on his head, looking at his truck the way men look at something they know they will have to explain to someone else later. Marcus stopped, looked left. The side street was passable but added 6 blocks to his route. He looked right. A police cruiser had angled across the intersection, lights going, the officer on the radio. Past the cruiser, more debris. Another blocked lane. He checked his watch. 9:09. He could feel the arithmetic of it happening in the back of his mind even while the front of his mind was still calculating routes and time and options. 21 minutes, 6 blocks detoured, each block maybe 90 seconds at a run. Not sprinting, he couldn't sprint in these shoes on broken pavement without going down. That was 9 extra minutes on top of the time already lost. He'd arrive at 9:30 on the nose, assuming nothing else blocked him, assuming the lobby of the Apex Dynamics building was accessible, assuming the elevator was working, assuming. He started moving again. Left turn, South Side Street, trying to hold his pace, the folder clamped against his ribs. The cut on his palm had stopped bleeding. Or rather, it had slowed enough that the blood was drying at the edges, tacky and dark, pulling at the skin when he flexed his hand. His shoulder ached with a deep, specific pain he recognized from years of managing it. The left one, the repaired separation, which liked to remind him of its history whenever he used it hard and fast without warming up first. He'd used it hard and fast to rotate a 400-kilogram concrete slab at an awkward angle 20 minutes ago, so the shoulder had a point. He rounded the corner onto Merchant Street and stopped again. This time it wasn't debris in the road. It was people. Maybe 40 or 50 of them, standing in the middle of the street in clusters, some on phones, some with their arms around each other, a few sitting on the curb with that particular glassy quality that Marcus associated with shock. The way the brain went quiet and put everything on a small screen somewhere behind the eyes when the body had processed too much too fast. Half a block ahead, a gas main had ruptured. Marcus could smell it, that distinctive mercaptan bite added specifically so you couldn't miss it. A fire truck was already on scene, firefighters in full gear, someone in an orange vest waving pedestrians back. The block was closed. Marcus stood at the edge of the crowd and did the math he'd been half doing for the past 3 minutes. He finished it now, all the way to the end, without flinching. If Merchant was closed, his detour became a longer detour. The longer detour put him at the Apex Dynamics building at 9:38 at the earliest. 8 minutes late. He'd been late to exactly 4 things in his adult life. 3 of them were funerals, 1 was the birth of his daughter, and he'd been doing 90 on the interstate for that one. He was not a man who was late to things, but he understood, standing at the edge of a gas main closure on a street full of shaken people, that being or not being the kind of man who is late to things was no longer the operative variable. He took his phone out and called the number on the interview confirmation email. It rang twice. Then a recording. Thank you for calling Apex Dynamics. Due to emergency conditions following this morning's seismic event, our offices are currently closed and all scheduled appointments have been suspended. Please check our website for updates regarding rescheduling. We apologize for... He hung up. He stood there for a moment. The gas smell was faint at this distance, but persistent. Somewhere behind him, a woman was crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the quiet, steady kind that sometimes takes over when people finally stop moving. He put his phone back in his pocket. Then he turned around and started walking toward Carlisle Elementary. That was the thing that clarified everything, in the way that crises have of burning away the clutter and leaving only what actually matters. The interview was gone. The number he could call was gone, at least for today, at least until the city put itself back together enough to think about things like job interviews again. There was nothing to run toward anymore in that direction. But Lily was 6 blocks south in a school building of indeterminate structural condition, and the city had just had a significant seismic event, and she was 8 years old, and Marcus had not heard her voice since 8:05 this morning when she walked away from him toward the crossing guard with her backpack bouncing. He walked fast. He didn't run. The streets were too unpredictable, too many people moving in too many directions. But he moved with the purposeful efficiency that had been trained into him at 22 and never fully left, the kind of forward motion that doesn't waste anything. He passed a man sitting on the steps of a closed hardware store, holding his wrist at a careful angle, face tight with pain. Marcus stopped. "That broken?" he asked. The man looked up, middle-aged, work clothes, dust on his shoulders. "Don't know," he said. "Might be." "Can you move the fingers?" The man moved them, slow and reluctant. "Yeah. Probably a sprain. Maybe a hairline fracture. Either way, you need it looked at. Is there someone who can take you?" "My wife's coming," the man said. "She's on her way." "Okay. Keep it elevated, at or above your heart. Don't try to use it." "Thanks," the man said, and looked at Marcus's shirt, the blood on his hand. "You all right?" "Yeah," Marcus said. "Take care of the wrist." He kept moving. The elementary school looked, from the outside, better than he'd feared. The building was a 1980s construction, concrete block, low-slung, the kind of architecture that was not pretty, but was solid in the way that things built without aesthetic ambition often are. The front face was intact. The parking lot had a crack running diagonally across it, wide enough to put a hand into, and the decorative fountain near the entrance had toppled and spilled water across the front path, but the walls were standing and the roof was on, and that was enough. That was everything. There were parents everywhere, arriving on foot, arriving in cars, arriving with the particular look of people who had been somewhere else when things went wrong and had been moving toward their children ever since. A teacher Marcus didn't recognize was standing near the front gate with a clipboard and a radio, directing people, keeping it organized. Inside the fence, on the grass of the small athletic area beside the building, the school's students were seated in class groups, teachers with them, some of the kids looking bewildered, some looking like they'd decided this was more interesting than a regular Tuesday, a few of the smaller ones crying. Marcus scanned the groups. Second grade, first grade, there. Third grade, Miss Abernethy's class, 18 kids on the grass in a loose cluster. He found Lily in approximately 4 seconds, which was how long it took his eyes to move through the group and identify the back of her head, the particular way she sat cross-legged with her spine very straight, a habit she'd developed from somewhere that wasn't him. She turned around before he called her name. He'd never figured out how she did that. She stood up. She didn't run to him because she was at the age where running to your parents in front of other kids required internal negotiation. But she walked fast, and when she reached the gate and he crouched down to her level, she put both arms around his neck and held on with a grip that told him everything the composed walk had been trying not to tell him. "You're here," she said into his shoulder. "I'm here," he said. He held her with both arms, the folder and the shoulder and the cut hand and all of it, and felt the particular thing that only happens when you've been afraid for someone, and then they're in your arms and the fear starts to leave your body slowly, like air from a tire. "Were you scared?" he asked. "A little bit," she said, which he suspected meant considerably more than a little bit. The lights went out, and then Ms. Abernethy made us go outside, and some of the kids were crying. A pause. "I wasn't crying." "There's nothing wrong with crying," Marcus said. "I know," she said, with a tone suggesting this was a position she was aware of in theory, but had not yet fully adopted in practice. He drove her home, his car, the 2011 Civic that burned slightly too much oil and needed new rear brake pads that he'd been deferring for 2 months, navigating streets that were half-functional, following detour signs that hadn't existed an hour ago, passing sections where work crews were already out assessing damage. The city was in the first stage of its response. that organized chaos phase where everything is simultaneously being assessed and addressed, and there isn't enough of anything for any of it. Lily was quiet in the back seat for the first few minutes. Then she said, "Did you make it to the interview?" He kept his eyes on the road. "No," he said. "They closed the building." "Because of the earthquake?" "Because of the earthquake." "Oh." A pause. "Will they reschedule it?" "Maybe," Marcus said. "Probably. I'll call them." "Okay," Lily said. And then, in a smaller voice, "I'm sorry, Daddy." "It's not your fault," he said immediately. "I know. I'm still sorry." He looked at her in the rearview mirror. She was watching the damaged city go by outside the window, her expression doing the thing it sometimes did, processing something, turning it over, not ready to put it into words yet. He looked back at the road. "Something else happened," he said, before he'd quite decided to say it. "What?" He told her. Not all of it, not the details about the structural assessment or the specific mechanics of moving the slab. She was 8. She didn't need the operational briefing. But he told her the shape of it, that there'd been a collapsed building, that someone was trapped, that he'd stopped and helped get her out before continuing toward the interview. Lily listened without interrupting. This was unusual. She was not typically a non-interrupter. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, then, "Did she get hurt bad?" Her arm was injured. She needed medical attention, but she was okay. "Did she say thank you?" Marcus thought about the woman's face in the dusty half-dark of the debris gap, the way she'd looked at him when she was out, when she was in the light. "She tried to," he said. "I had to go." "You didn't wait for her to say thank you?" "There were paramedics coming," Marcus said. "She didn't need me anymore." Lily seemed to be weighing something. "Do you wish you hadn't stopped?" she asked. The question was careful, the way her careful questions always were. Not innocent, but genuinely open, genuinely asking. Marcus considered giving her the easy answer, the clean answer. He considered saying no, of course not with the kind of confident parental finality that closes the subject. But she was 8, not 4, and she was asking him something real, and she deserved a real answer. "It complicated things," he said. "I'm not going to pretend it didn't. But do you wish you hadn't?" He thought about the woman's voice, the specific texture of it, thin and strained and trying to stay functional while her arm was pinned and dust was settling around her, and she couldn't hear anything that sounded like rescue. He thought about driving away from that voice, about what the rest of the morning would have looked like if he had, whether the interview would have gone differently, whether any of it would have mattered once he was sitting across from someone asking him questions, knowing what he'd left behind him. "No," he said. "I don't wish I hadn't stopped." Lily nodded, like this confirmed something. She went back to looking out the window. They didn't talk about it again that evening. The days that followed the earthquake were the kind that don't feel like days in the normal sense. They felt like a single extended condition, a pressurized state of managing more than could comfortably be managed. The city was in recovery mode, which meant everything was harder and slower and more expensive. And the people who had the least margin for things to be harder, slower, and more expensive were experiencing that reality first and worst. Carlisle Elementary stayed closed for 4 days while structural engineers assessed the building. Marcus arranged for Lily to stay with Donna Merrick, his neighbor 2 floors down, a retired postal worker who had a small terrier named Frank and a very strong opinion about the correct way to make rice, which was not the way Marcus made rice, but which Lily had adopted enthusiastically after 3 days of exposure. He paid Donna for the childcare in the form of a fixed leaky faucet in her kitchen, which had been dripping for 6 months, and which she'd been meaning to call someone about, and which Marcus took care of in 40 minutes with parts from the hardware store on Delancey. He called the Apex Dynamics number every day for 4 days. Twice a day on the first 2 days, once a day after that when it became clear that the recorded message was not changing. He sent an email, formal, concise, the kind of communication that took him 40 minutes to compose because he didn't write professional emails naturally, didn't have the voice for it the way some people seem to from birth. He explained that he'd had a confirmed interview on the morning of the earthquake, that he'd been en route when the seismic event occurred, that he remained very interested in the position and would welcome the opportunity to reschedule. He didn't mention this woman in the rubble. It didn't seem relevant to include, and including it felt like the wrong kind of thing, like using something private as a resume line. No response came in the first week. On the 5th day after the earthquake, Lily went back to school and Marcus went back to job searching. He had 22 active applications on file, companies he'd reached out to before Apex Dynamics, some of whom had sent polite rejections, some of whom had not responded at all, and a few who had expressed vague interest in a way that had faded in the weeks since into silence. He updated his availability status on the 3 job platforms he'd registered with. He added a note to his profile acknowledging the disruption caused by the earthquake and expressing his readiness to interview remotely or in person as circumstances allowed. He applied for 12 additional positions over the following week. He heard back from 2 of them. The first was a warehouse logistics coordinator role that paid $11 less per hour than Apex Dynamics had listed and required mandatory weekend availability, possible, but requiring a childcare rearrangement he wasn't sure he could sustain. He asked for an interview time. They gave him 3 weeks out. The second was a security firm looking for a site supervisor, and the callback was a form email informing him that the position had been filled internally. He was burning through his reserve funds at a rate that he'd calculated precisely, the way he calculated things that scared him. At current expenditures, rent, utilities, Lily's medication, food, transportation, the minimum payment on the credit card he'd started using for the gap between his expenses and the part-time hours he was picking up, doing demolition assessments for a small private firm, 3 days a week, cash, technically informal. He had 11 weeks before the math became a conversation he did not want to have with himself. 11 weeks was not nothing. People rebuilt in less time than 11 weeks. The city was rebuilding, visibly, concretely. Every morning, Marcus drove Lily to school. He could see it happening. Cranes going up, crews out. A systematic, if imperfect, reassembly. He told himself 11 weeks was enough. He mostly believed it. On the 9th evening after the earthquake, he was at the kitchen table after Lily went to bed, working through a demolition assessment report that the firm needed by morning, 3 pages of observations from a site visit that afternoon, with recommendations for safe access and hazard mitigation. The work paid $30 an hour for his time on site and nothing for the paperwork, but the paperwork was part of the work and Marcus did not do things halfway. He heard something. Not a knock exactly, more like someone testing the door, the specific sound of knuckles making contact with wood at less than full commitment, the sound of someone who isn't sure whether to announce themselves fully or retreat. He checked the time. 7:44 p.m. Lily was asleep. His neighbor Donna sometimes knocked at odd hours, but she had a distinctive 4-beat pattern, and this wasn't that. He opened the door. The woman standing in the hallway was someone he almost didn't recognize, which was not entirely surprising. The last time he'd seen her, she'd been covered in concrete dust, lying on her back in a debris field with her arm pinned and her face cut and her eyes trying to stay focused on him through the shock. She was none of those things now. She was standing upright in the fluorescent light of the 4th-floor hallway of a building in the Whitmore district, wearing a dark coat, a cast and brace on her left forearm, from the wrist to just below the elbow, her hair down, her expression doing something complicated that Marcus couldn't immediately categorize. She looked like someone who had prepared what they were going to say, and then, when the door actually opened, found that all the preparation had gone somewhere else. He recognized her anyway. The eyes, maybe. Or the particular quality of the stillness, the way she held herself under pressure, which was something he'd noticed even when she was hurt and afraid. The way some people had a core of self-containment that didn't fully dissolve even in extremity. "You're the man from the building," she said. Not a question. "You're the woman from the building," Marcus said. Also not a question. She seemed to be recalibrating. "That's not how I planned to start this," she said. "Do you want to come in?" he asked. He wasn't sure, as the words left his mouth, that it was the right thing to offer. She was a stranger. It was nearly 8 in the evening. His daughter was asleep 15 feet away. But it seemed worse to have whatever this conversation was going to be in a hallway. She looked at the open door, then at him. "Okay," she said. "Yes, thank you." He led her to the kitchen because the kitchen was the only room with more than one chair that didn't require him to move things first. She sat at the table. He moved his assessment report aside and remained standing for a moment, and then sat across from her because remaining standing felt like the wrong way to do this. "How did you find me?" he asked. "Paramedics," she said. "The team that responded to my location, I asked them if they'd seen the man who'd helped me. One of them said he'd seen a man in a dress shirt moving north on foot after the emergency vehicles arrived. That was enough to know you'd been heading somewhere specific. I described you to a couple of people in the area." She paused. "It took a while. The city wasn't exactly organized for tracking people down." "No," Marcus agreed. "Someone at the bus stop, the bus that had stopped on Morrison, remembered a man in a tie getting off right after the first tremor. From there I found the bus route, and the bus company has a general service corridor. Then I hired someone." She said this last part without emphasis, without either apology or elaboration, the way someone states a practical fact. Marcus looked at the cast on her arm. "How bad is it?" "2 fractures," she said. "Ulna and radius, both. Surgery on the second fracture. There was some displacement." She said this cleanly, without performance. She'd been through it and processed it and moved on from the emotional part, or at least moved it somewhere it wasn't visible. The surgeon said another 20 minutes under that slab, and the vascular compression would have become a different kind of problem. 20 minutes is a long time, Marcus said. "Yes," she said, "it is." There was a silence that wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but was full of things that hadn't been said yet. Marcus waited. He had the impression that she was someone who said things when she was ready to say them and not before, and that rushing her would produce less rather than more. "I'm Victoria Hale," she said. "My father is Daniel Hale. He founded Apex Dynamics." The name registered before the implication did, and then the implication landed and Marcus understood why the silence had been the shape it was. He looked at her. "I know," she said. "You had an interview there. I know about the interview. I checked the scheduling records when I was trying to find out who you were and what you'd been doing in that part of the city." "Okay," Marcus said, because he didn't have a better response ready. "I'm the CEO," she said. "My father stepped back 2 years ago. I run the company now." She said this without apparent pride or defensiveness, the same flat informational tone. "I also know that you didn't make it to your interview. I know you'd been sending follow-up communications. I know the position you were applying for." Marcus was quiet. In the hallway, the building's ancient radiator made its signature sound, a sound he'd stopped hearing months ago because the brain tunes out the things it can't change, and then went quiet again. "I'm not here to offer you anything you didn't earn," Victoria said. She seemed to want to be clear about this. "I looked at your application file, your service record, the coursework, the 3 assessors at Apex who reviewed your materials before the earthquake. 2 of them had flagged you for first-round interviews. You were already in the process. You just didn't get to finish it." "Why are you here?" Marcus asked. He wasn't being rude. He wanted to understand the actual reason, not the official version of it. She looked at him steadily. Her arm was in the cast, her hands resting on the table, and she had the specific quality of someone who is accustomed to being looked at, to being in rooms where other people are forming impressions of her, and has become neither threatened by it nor entirely comfortable with it. "Because I was under a concrete slab," she said, "and you didn't walk past. And I've spent 9 days trying to find you. And I've thought a lot about why you were in that part of the city and what it meant that you stopped." A pause. "And because I wanted to know who you were, before anything else. I wanted to know who the person was." Marcus looked at the table, at his assessment report, the edge visible under Victoria's coat where he'd pushed it, at the chipped blue mug sitting by the sink from this morning's coffee, the handle with its line of dried super glue. "I'm a person who was late to a job interview," he said. "You weren't late," Victoria said. "You were prevented." "That's a generous reading." "It's an accurate one." She straightened slightly. "I'm going to ask you some questions. The same kind of questions you would have been asked in the interview. Not tonight. You have a child asleep in there and it's almost 8 o'clock. But I'd like to meet with you properly, at the building when it's open again, which should be Monday, And I'd like you to consider the possibility that what happened 9 days ago doesn't have to cost you everything it almost cost you. Marcus thought about Lily at breakfast, cutting her banana into circles, about 11 weeks of reserve funds, about the warehouse logistics role that paid $11 less per hour and required mandatory weekends, about the woman's voice in the dark of the debris gap, the way it had sounded when she said, "Please don't leave." "I'll come in Monday," he said. Victoria nodded. She stood, which was slightly awkward with the cast. She had to use the table edge for balance, and she did it without pretending she didn't, without performing capabilities she didn't currently have. Marcus almost stood to help her and didn't, because she wasn't asking, and the impulse, he recognized, was more about his own discomfort with seeing someone manage difficulty than about anything she needed. "Monday," she said. 9:30. "I know the time," Marcus said. Something crossed her expression. Not quite a smile, not a smile. "Good," she said. She moved toward the apartment door and Marcus walked behind her, and at the door she paused and turned back. "Your hand," she said. She was looking at his left palm, the cut from the concrete edge, now a scabbed line that he'd almost stopped noticing. "Is it healing all right?" "It's fine," he said. "Okay," she said, and looked at him in a way that had too many things in it to categorize quickly. "Monday," she said again, and then she was in the hallway and he was closing the door behind her. He stood with his back against the closed door for a moment. From Lily's room, no sound. She was still asleep. The radiator knocked once and settled. The refrigerator hummed. The city outside was doing what it was doing, piecing itself back together in the dark, imperfect and unfinished, one cracked block at a time. Marcus went back to the table. He moved Victoria's chair back to where it belonged. He sat down and looked at the assessment report. He picked up his pen. He had work to finish. Monday came the way Mondays do after bad week, without ceremony, without any particular indication that it intended to be different from the days before it. Marcus was up at 5:30, which was when he always woke up whether he intended to or not. The internal clock set by years of military reveille that no amount of civilian life had managed to reset. He lay in the dark for a few minutes, listening to the building, the radiator, the distant sound of someone's alarm 2 floors up, the particular quality of city silence at that hour, which wasn't silence at all but a lower register of noise that the brain eventually learned to file under quiet. Then he got up, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with his phone and the notepad where he kept his running list of things that needed doing. The list was longer than he liked. At the top, underlined twice because he'd added the underlines on separate occasions when it had seemed important to emphasize to himself, Apex Dynamics, Monday 9:30 a.m. Below that, the warehouse logistics callback he needed to follow up on, now pushed back another week given everything. The oil change the Civic needed and had needed for 6 weeks. Lily's school picture forms due Friday. A follow-up call to the informal demolition firm about the possibility of more hours, which he'd been meaning to make for 4 days and kept not making because making it felt like accepting that this was the direction things were going, and he hadn't fully accepted that yet. He crossed out the Apex Dynamics line. Not because it was done, because it was today, and today it would either become something or it wouldn't, and either way it would stop being a line on a list. He woke Lily at 7. She appeared in the kitchen doorway in her star pajamas, hair on one side, squinting against the light the way she did every morning for the first 5 minutes, which was a quality she had inherited directly from her mother, and which Marcus found, on most mornings, somewhere between endearing and logistically frustrating depending on how much time they had. "You're wearing the shirt again," she said. Marcus looked down. He was wearing a different shirt, dark blue, the other good one, the one without bloodstains, but he understood what she meant. The interview clothes. The dressed-up version of him that she'd seen 3 weeks ago, standing in this same kitchen pulling at a tie. "It's a different shirt," he said. "It's the same idea," she said, and went to get herself a bowl from the cabinet. He drove her to school and then drove across the city to Apex Dynamics. The route was different from the one he'd taken the morning of the earthquake. Not deliberately, just the way the roads were now, the modified traffic patterns around the block still under repair. The detour signs that had become so familiar in 3 weeks that they barely registered as unusual. The city was healing, visibly, the way a body heals. Not cleanly, not uniformly, with scars in some places and full recovery in others, and a few spots that were still very much in process. He passed one block where the damaged building had already been fully cordoned off and preliminary demolition begun. The orange mesh fencing around it, the equipment parked and waiting for the workday to start. He passed another block where the damage was minimal and the storefront was open and a man was hosing down the sidewalk in front of it like it was any regular morning, which in a certain sense it was. The Apex Dynamics building was intact. He'd checked this, looked it up online before the weekend, because he'd wanted to know before he was standing in front of it. 14 stories, modern construction, the kind of building that used to make him think of a different kind of life. The kind of life that happened inside buildings like that, with badge readers and conference rooms and people who had actual job titles on business cards. He parked in the visitor lot, which was 3/4 full at 9:05 a.m., which told him the company had reopened fully and was operating at normal capacity. He sat in the car for a moment, not because he was nervous, he told himself he wasn't nervous, but because he was doing the thing he'd done before operations, the thing his first team leader had called interval, that few seconds of taking stock before the situation became active and stock-taking became a luxury. He went inside. Victoria Hale was not in the lobby, which made sense. She ran a 14-story engineering company and had presumably more to do at 9:08 on a Monday morning than stand in her own lobby. A receptionist directed him to the 11th floor, gave him a visitor badge, called someone to let them know he was on his way up. The elevator worked. The lobby had a crack in one corner of the marble floor, recently repaired with a slightly off-color grout that didn't quite match the original. The building's own small scar, neatly addressed and still visible if you looked. On the 11th floor, a woman named Priya. She introduced herself with the kind of professional warmth that came from years of practice and was genuine anyway, led him to a conference room with a view of the east side of the city and offered him water or coffee. He took the water. He sat at the conference table and looked at the east side of the city through the glass and thought about the fact that somewhere in that direction, 3 weeks ago, he'd stood at the edge of a debris field and made a decision in 2 seconds that he'd been living with ever since. Victoria arrived 7 minutes later. She was wearing a gray suit jacket over a white blouse, and the cast was gone from her left forearm, replaced by a smaller brace, the kind worn during the later stages of healing when things have been put back together but haven't finished becoming solid. She was carrying a tablet and a coffee cup and a folder, and she set all three on the table with the practiced efficiency of someone who moved through professional spaces the way Marcus moved through physical ones, with an economy of motion that came from doing a thing many times until you stopped wasting any of it. "You found parking," she said. "Visitor lot," he said. "Good." She sat across from him, opened the folder, looked at something in it, then looked at him. "How's the hand?" He'd almost forgotten he'd asked about his hand when she left his apartment. "Healed," he said, which was true. The scab had come off 4 days ago and left a thin pink line across his palm that would fade in a few months. "Good," she said again. And then, as if deciding something, she closed the folder. "I'm going to tell you something before we start, because I want it on the table and not underneath the table where we'd both be aware of it anyway." "Okay," Marcus said. "I already know I want to hire you," she said. "That's not a negotiation tactic. I'm saying it because I think you should know the shape of this conversation before we have it. I reviewed your file thoroughly. I spoke with the 2 assessors who flagged you before the earthquake. I also—" She paused briefly, the first pause he'd seen from her. "I thought about you a lot in the 9 days it took me to find you, about what kind of person does what you did and then walks away without waiting to be thanked. I formed impressions. Some of them might be wrong, and the conversation I want to have is partly about finding out where I'm wrong." She picked up her coffee cup. "But I want you to know that you're not in here trying to convince me of something I'm skeptical about. That's a different kind of pressure than the pressure of a regular interview, and I thought you should know which one you're in." Marcus looked at her. He was trying to read her the way he read things: structural integrity, load-bearing capacity, where the stable points were and where the pressure was distributed. And what he found was someone who was being more direct with him than most people were in professional settings, and who appeared to mean it. "Why does it matter to you that I know?" he asked. Because you walked away from a job you needed to pull me out of a collapsed building, she said. The least I can do is be straight with you. He thought about the right response to that and didn't find one that wasn't either too much or too little, so he just nodded. Okay, he said, then ask me what you want to know. She did. The conversation lasted an hour and 40 minutes, and it was not like any interview Marcus had been in before, which was not many. He'd had 2 civilian job interviews in his adult life before this, both for positions he hadn't gotten, both following a format he'd found strained and artificial, the professional equivalent of a first date where both people were pretending the evaluation wasn't happening. This was different. Victoria asked him real questions and listened to the answers with her full attention, the kind of attention that doesn't look away and doesn't start formulating the next question before you finish the current one. She asked about his service, not the patriotic version, not the version people asked about at cookouts when they wanted a story, but the operational specifics, how he made decisions under incomplete information, how he managed people who didn't want to be managed, what he'd gotten wrong specifically, and what he'd learned from it. He told her about the operation in Kandahar, where he'd miscalculated a timeline by 20 minutes, and it had cost his team a clean extraction and one of his men a bone-shattering drop from a wall he hadn't expected to have to go over in the dark. He told her about the team member he'd had to report for conduct violations in his 3rd year, a man he'd liked personally and who had been with him through 2 of the worst months of his deployment, and how he'd made the report anyway because the alternative was endorsing something he couldn't endorse. He told her about the year after he got out, when he hadn't been able to find a direction and had spent 8 months doing nothing much in particular and drinking slightly more than he should have and not being the father Lily needed, and how he'd pulled out of it not because of any single dramatic moment, but because Lily had looked at him one morning over breakfast and said, "Are you okay, Daddy?" in a tone that had nothing childlike in it at all, and something in him had decided it was done. Victoria listened to all of it. She asked follow-up questions that were specific and sharp, not adversarial, just exact. The questions of someone who wanted to understand the actual thing and not the cleaned-up version. At one point, she put her tablet down entirely and just listened with her hands around her coffee cup, and Marcus had the strange experience of feeling more comfortable in a professional setting than he ever had before, which he suspected had something to do with the fact that neither of them was pretending about anything. At the end, she slid a single sheet of paper across the table. He looked at it. The position was called Senior Field Operations Director. The salary listed at the bottom of the page made Marcus read very still for approximately 5 seconds. "That's not a salary for a field supervisor," he said. "No," she said. "It's a salary for someone who runs field operations across multiple project sites, manages team leads, interfaces with the engineering and logistics divisions, and reports directly to me." She looked at him steadily. "The previous person in that role retired 8 months ago. We've been operating with the position split across 3 people who are all doing their own jobs at the same time. And it's been a problem." A pause. "I think you can do it. I wouldn't put that number on the page if I didn't." Marcus looked at the number again. He thought about 11 weeks of reserve funds, about the warehouse job paying $11 less per hour, about the blue mug with the superglued handle and the cabinet door that didn't close, and the assessment report he'd finished at midnight on a Monday 3 weeks ago because $30 an hour for on-site time and nothing for paperwork was what the present moment offered, and so it was what he'd done. "I've never held a corporate title," he said. "I know. I don't have a degree." "I know that too." She said it without apology for knowing, without the particular diplomatic softness people applied to that fact when they used it as a reason to decline. "I have directors with MBAs who can't walk a construction site without getting in the way. I have people with 20 years of corporate experience who fall apart when a timeline shifts unexpectedly and they have to make a call without a supervisor to refer to." She tilted her head slightly. "You made a structural assessment of a partially collapsed building under seismic aftershock conditions, alone, with no equipment, calculated a load-bearing solution on the fly, executed it with an injury, and made sure the person you were helping was fully in the hands of emergency responders before you left." She let that sit for a moment. "I'm less interested in what's on paper than I am in what people do when the paper runs out." Marcus sat with that for a moment. "I'd need time to get up to speed on the company's systems," he said. The project management structure, the reporting format, the specific protocols. I'm not going to walk in and act like I know things I don't know. I'd be suspicious of you if you didn't need time, Victoria said. I'm not looking for someone who pretends. He picked up the paper and read the full description of the role more carefully. The scope was larger than anything he'd managed before in terms of organizational structure. Multiple teams, multiple sites, a budget responsibility that required a different kind of thinking than he was used to. But the bones of it were familiar: resources, timelines, people in the field making decisions under pressure while he provided the framework that let them make the right ones. He understood the bones of it. I have a daughter, he said. She's 8. I'm the only parent she has. I know, Victoria said. I'm saying that if the job requires the kind of hours that means I see her on weekends and otherwise she's in the care of a neighbor, then the salary doesn't cover what I'd actually be paying. Victoria looked at him for a moment. Something in her expression was not quite what he'd expected, though he wasn't sure what he'd expected. The role has demanding periods, she said. Project delivery deadlines, crisis response when things go sideways on a site. But it's not a 70-hour-a-week job structurally. The people who made it that way were doing it wrong. She paused. I'll put the core hours expectations in writing. If what you see there doesn't work, we can talk about it. But I'm not interested in having someone in that position who's running on empty at home, because people running on empty make bad calls eventually. Marcus nodded slowly. Can I have until Wednesday? He said. Yes, she said, without hesitation. Not the hesitation he'd expected, the slight stiffening that he'd seen in negotiations before when the other person had expected a different answer and had to quickly recalibrate. She'd expected him to take time. She'd factored it in. Wednesday, he said. She extended her right hand across the table. He shook it. Yeah. He drove back through the city's imperfect recovery and picked Lily up from school at 3 o'clock and took her to the diner on Clement Street that they went to when there was something to talk about, which was a designation Lily had established herself at age 6 and which Marcus had never questioned because it was a reasonable system. The diner had vinyl booths and a counter with rotating stools and a laminated menu that hadn't changed since at least the previous decade. Lily always got the grilled cheese. Marcus always got the turkey club and ate most of the chips, and then gave the rest to Lily, who ate chips in a very specific order based on size that she never explained, and Marcus had never asked about. They ordered. Lily ate 3 chips before the food arrived, which was allowed. How was it? She asked. Good, Marcus said. She waited. She had learned, somewhere in her 8 years, the value of waiting. They offered me something, he said. The interview job? A different one. Bigger. He thought about how to translate the shape of it into terms that would mean something to her. Remember when I used to tell you about coordinating missions? In the Navy, when there were multiple teams in different places and someone had to keep track of all of them and make sure everything was happening at the right time in the right order. You were the one doing that, Lily said. Sometimes. This is like that, but for construction projects instead of military operations. Lily considered this with the seriousness she brought to things that mattered. Is it more money than the first job? Yes, Marcus said. How much more? He told her the number. She looked at him with an expression that was half trying to process the scale of it and half trying to decide if she was supposed to already understand what that meant. Is that a lot? She said. Yeah, Marcus said. That's a lot. She was quiet for a moment. Their food arrived. The waitress, a woman named Deirdre, who had been working this diner for as long as Marcus and Lily had been coming here, set down their plates and refilled Marcus's coffee without asking and left them alone, which was part of why they kept coming here. So why do you have to think about it until Wednesday? Lily asked. She was looking at her grilled cheese, pulling it apart slightly to check the cheese distribution. Another ritual Marcus had never interrogated. Because big decisions deserve to be thought about, Marcus said. Even good ones? Especially good ones. Lily bit into her sandwich. She chewed, looked at the middle distance with the expression of someone doing interior calculations. Is it the lady who came to our apartment? She asked. Her voice was careful, which meant she'd been thinking about this and wasn't sure she should ask. Yes, Marcus said. She's the one who gave you the job? She runs the company. Lily processed this. She has a broken arm, she said. It's healing. Because of you, Lily said. Not accusingly, not with any particular weight, just the way she stated facts that she was certain of. She would have been found eventually, Marcus said, which was something he believed and also something that was technically impossible to know. But you found her faster, Lily said, and now she's giving you a job. It's more complicated than— I know it's more complicated, Lily said, with the gentle patience of someone who has heard that phrase many times. I'm just saying the short version. Marcus looked at her. She had a line of melted cheese on her chin that she hadn't noticed yet. He handed her a napkin. She wiped her chin without self-consciousness and handed it back. Do you like her? Lily asked. I barely know her. But do you like her so far? Marcus thought about the conference room, about Victoria closing the folder before the conversation began and telling him the shape of it so he'd know where he stood. About the way she'd listen, fully, without performance. About the fact that she'd asked about his hand on her way out the door of his apartment at 8 in the evening, after a conversation that had required considerably more of her than asking about someone's hand. So far, he said carefully, she seems like someone who means what she says. Lily nodded. In her private taxonomy, this appeared to be sufficient. She went back to her grilled cheese. Marcus called Victoria on Tuesday at 11 in the morning and accepted the position. He'd spent Monday evening reading everything he could find about Apex Dynamics, their project portfolio, the scope of their current active sites, what he could access of their public reporting structure, a profile of Victoria Hale from a Business Journal interview 2 years prior in which she described her management philosophy with a precision that matched fairly exactly what she'd said to him in the conference room. He'd gone to bed at midnight and lay there running through the logic of it until the logic stopped finding new objections to raise, and he recognized what was left of his hesitation for what it was, which was not a rational reservation about the job, but an older, deeper anxiety about allowing himself to believe that something was going to work out. He'd believed things were going to work out before. The military career had been one of those things. Sarah, Lily's mother, who had been gone for 4 years now, first to another city and eventually to a silence he'd stopped trying to interpret, had been another. But that was a different kind of risk. And at some point, Marcus had decided, not recently, not as a reaction to this specific situation, but as a general orientation that he'd arrived at slowly over the past few years, that refusing to believe in things because they might not work out was just a slower version of giving up. He called at 11. Victoria answered after 2 rings. I'll take it, he said. A brief silence. Good, she said, and then less formally. I'm glad. I have some questions about the onboarding process, Marcus said, when it makes sense to go over them. Thursday? She said. I have a 2-hour block in the afternoon. We can go through the project portfolio, introduce you to the 2 team leads you'll be working with most directly, and get you into the system. Thursday works, Marcus said. 9 to 5 scheduled to start, she said. I'll have Priya send you the onboarding packet today. There's a lot of it. Some of it is relevant, and some of it is HR bureaucracy that exists because large organizations can't function without HR bureaucracy. I've dealt with military bureaucracy, Marcus said. This can't be worse. It might be different, she said. Civilian bureaucracy has a different flavor. More forms, fewer acronyms, same essential pointlessness. He almost smiled. I'll manage. I know you will, she said, and then, Marcus. It was the first time she'd used his name. He noticed this the way he noticed things, quietly, filing it. Yeah, he said. Thank you for calling today, she said. I know it wasn't the simplest decision. No, he said, but it was the right one. He could hear her considering saying something else and deciding not to. Thursday, she said instead. 9:30? I'll be early, he said. I assumed you would, she said, and ended the call. He sat at the kitchen table for a moment after, the same table where he'd been sitting at midnight 3 weeks ago finishing a demolition assessment report for $30 an hour, the same table where Victoria Hale had sat across from him in the fluorescent light of the Whitmore district and told him she'd hired someone to track him down. The same table where Lily sat every morning with her oatmeal and her systematic arrangement of banana slices and her steady, unsentimental assessment of him. He picked up his phone and called the warehouse logistics company. He withdrew his application, politely, briefly, without drama. He called the informal demolition firm and told them he was starting a full-time position and wouldn't be available for the informal work going forward. He crossed items off his list. He added new ones, things he needed to prepare for Thursday, documents to gather, questions to write down before he forgot them. He was halfway through the list when his phone buzzed with an email from Priya at Apex Dynamics. The onboarding packet. He opened it. There were 17 attachments. He made more coffee and started reading. Thursday came with the specific quality of beginnings. Not ceremonial, not weighted with the gravity that movies assign to first days of things, but carrying a quiet sense of gear shift, of moving from one mode into another. Marcus dropped Lily at school at 7:50 and drove across the city in the early traffic, which was heavier than he expected on the new route he'd mapped to avoid the sections still under repair. He arrived at the Apex Dynamics parking structure at 9:14 and sat in the car for the brief interval he always took before things became active. He was not the same man who had sat in this lot. He hadn't been in a lot. He'd been on a bus. He'd never made it to the lot 3 weeks ago. He wasn't sure precisely what the difference was, or whether it was a difference he could name cleanly. He was employed. He was beginning something. He had eaten breakfast that morning, which Lily had noted approvingly. He was wearing the blue shirt again, which she had accepted with philosophical resignation. He went inside. Priya met him in the lobby with a badge that had his name on it and a photograph taken from the employee portal he'd set up on Tuesday. The photograph was slightly off. He'd taken it himself with his phone in the kitchen, and the light had come from the wrong angle. But it was close enough to recognizable, and he supposed that was the point of an ID badge, to be close enough. The first hour was with HR, which was, as described, forms, digital signatures, system logins, a 15-minute video about workplace safety protocols that had clearly been produced before he'd been born and hadn't been updated since. He sat through it with the patience of someone who had survived military safety briefings and understood that the formal components of beginning were not the actual beginning and were better treated as preamble than as content. Then Priya took him upstairs, and the building opened up into the real version of itself. The 11th floor, the East Wing, where the operations division lived, a large open plan with project maps on 2 of the walls, and the particular busy but functional quality of people who had clear jobs and were doing them. He was introduced to a project manager named Celia Osei, mid-40s, with close-cropped hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and a handshake that left no ambiguity about where she stood on the question of soft handshakes. She looked at him with an expression that was professional and assessive in equal measure. "Victoria told us about you," Celia said. "What did she tell you?" Marcus asked. Celia's expression adjusted slightly, the way someone's does when they recalibrate their expectation of a person. That you had an unusual background and direct experience that was relevant to the role, and that we should give you 90 days before we formed any fixed opinions. "That's fair," Marcus said. "Yes," Celia said, in a tone that acknowledged fairness as a concept while reserving judgment on its application. "It is." He met the second team lead, a man named Dennis Kwan, who was 31 and already had the energy of someone who'd been doing the job of 3 people for 8 months and had adapted to it so completely that he no longer remembered what one person's job felt like. Dennis shook his hand and showed him the project tracking system and talked at a productive speed about 4 of the active sites in terms that were mostly unfamiliar in their specific vocabulary and entirely familiar in their underlying logic. Marcus listened and took notes, actual written notes, in the narrow spiral notebook he'd brought from home, the kind he'd always used in the field, and asked the specific questions that told Dennis he was following and not just performing attention. Victoria came in at 11:30, between a meeting and whatever was next on her schedule, which appeared to be full. She'd been in the building the whole morning, but he hadn't seen her, and he noticed as she walked into the operations area that the dynamic in the room shifted slightly when she entered. Not fearful, not performative, just the subtle adjustment of a space around someone with authority. She'd earned it, he thought. not inherited it. Or she'd inherited the company and then earned the way people responded to her, which was different. "How's the morning?" she asked him, standing near the project wall with her tablet under her arm. "Good," he said. "Dennis has been through 3 of the 4 sites. We're doing the 4th after lunch. Anything surprising?" He thought about it honestly. "The Kellerman Bridge project has a timeline that looks optimistic to me based on the crew staffing and the weather window," he said. "But I don't have full context yet." Victoria looked at Celia, who was standing nearby. Something passed between them. Not disagreement, more like confirmation. "That's the ongoing argument," Celia said to Marcus. "We've been telling the client the timeline is aggressive for 2 months. I'll get the full picture before I say anything more about it," Marcus said. "I don't have the context to be useful yet." "That's already more than the last person in this role said in his first week," Celia said, and went back to her desk, which Marcus took as a form of positive assessment. Victoria was watching him, not in a way that had anything beyond the professional in it. She was reading him the way she'd read him in the conference room, with the same directness and the same absence of performance, checking her impressions against the reality of him in the actual environment. "Lunch at 1?" she said. "There's a place on the 2nd floor. Nothing special, but it's food." "Works for me," he said. She nodded and was already moving back toward wherever she was going, tablet under arm, unhurried but clearly in forward motion. Marcus turned back to the project wall. He looked at the 4 sites mapped there, their locations, their phases, their staffing notations. He pulled a chair over and sat down with his notebook and started writing questions, the way he'd always done at the beginning of operations when the situation was new. And the most important thing was to identify precisely what you didn't know yet, so you could stop not knowing it as efficiently as possible. He wrote for 20 minutes. The operations area moved and talked and functioned around him. Someone brought a box of donuts from somewhere and set it on the common table, and Marcus took one without being asked, which was the kind of small social calibration that mattered more than it appeared to. Dennis came back from a call and saw the notebook and said without apparent irony, "Nobody in this office takes actual physical notes anymore." And Marcus said, "That explains some of the things I saw in the tracking system." And Dennis laughed. A real one, the kind that surprised the person doing it. And the day moved forward. At 1 o'clock, Marcus went downstairs to the 2nd floor cafeteria and found Victoria already at a corner table with a sandwich and her tablet, which she put face down when he sat across from her, which he understood as a gesture and received it as one. "First impression of the team?" she asked. "Celia is holding things together with willpower and mild resentment," Marcus said. "Dennis is talented and running out of runway. The Kellerman timeline needs to be renegotiated with the client before it becomes an emergency." Victoria looked at him. 3 hours, she said. "It's all in the data," Marcus said. "I just read it." "Most people don't read it," she said. They read the summary, and then they read the summary of the summary." "I don't have enough context yet to trust summaries," Marcus said. "When I have context, I'll trust them more." "Maybe." She smiled at that. The first full one he'd seen from her. Not the almost smile from his apartment doorway, but the actual version. It changed her face, not dramatically, but enough. "Okay," she said. "Tell me what you need to address the Kellerman situation, and I'll make sure you have access to it." He told her. She made a note. They ate. The conversation moved between the professional and the adjacent to personal in the way that conversations between people who have an unusual shared history sometimes do. Not crossing into anything that needed to be named, but not pretending that the only context between them was this corner table and these sandwiches and the building around them. At a certain point, she said, "Your daughter, Lily." And he said yes, and she said, "Is the schedule working so far?" And he said it was, and she said, "If it stops working, tell me before it becomes a problem." In the same direct way she said everything, and he said he would, and meant it. He left the building at 5:17 because there was a handoff note he wanted to finish for Dennis about the 4th project site, and it had taken slightly longer than he'd planned, and he drove across the partial city to pick Lily up from Donna Merrick's apartment, where she was playing cards with Donna's terrier, Frank, sitting on the chair between them, like a moderator. "You're late," Lily said. Not accusingly, just noting. 17 minutes, Marcus said. "Still late." "Fair," he said. Donna made him take a container of rice home with him, The correct kind of rice, made the correct way according to Donna's specifications, and Marcus thanked her and took it and drove home through the city's evening traffic, Lily in the back seat describing the card game in more detail than was strictly necessary. Frank having apparently cheated in some way that couldn't be proven but was widely suspected. He made dinner around the rice, there was chicken in the refrigerator, and he had enough energy left to do it properly, rather than just heating something. And they ate together at the kitchen table, and Lily told him about a disagreement she'd had with her friend Priya at school, which was apparently a different Priya from the Priya at his new job. And Marcus listened and asked the right questions and did not offer solutions she hadn't asked for, which was something he'd gotten wrong for years and had slowly gotten better at. After Lily was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with his notebook and reviewed what he'd written that morning. He added 3 more items. He looked at the project wall he'd been studying, the image of it still clear in his memory, the way maps and operational layouts always stayed clear. He'd always had a spatial memory that held structures, the relationships between things, the way the parts of a system connected to each other. He thought about what it had taken to get to this table on this evening, the 4 months of applications, the carefully prepared resume in the manila folder with the clear plastic cover, the 9 minutes he'd stood on a bus platform after the ground shook and the routes north changed, and everything he'd been building toward that morning started to come apart. 2 seconds in front of a debris field on a broken street. He didn't think about it often. The decision itself, that specific pause before he'd crossed the street. When he did, he found it wasn't the thing people might have expected it to be. It wasn't noble. It wasn't heroic in the way stories made heroism sound. It was just the thing he could not have not done, which was a different category entirely, and he wasn't sure it deserved the weight that circumstance had ended up placing on it. What he was sure of was that Lily was asleep in the next room, that tomorrow was Friday and she had school and he had work, and both of those things were real and solid in a way they hadn't been a month ago. That the radiator was still knocking and the cabinet door was still not closing right, and the mug with the superglued handle was still in the dish drainer where it always was. And none of those things had changed, but the context around them had shifted into something he could stand on. He closed his notebook. He went to bed at 10:47, which was the earliest he'd been in bed on a weeknight in 4 months, and he was asleep before his mind found its way back to anything that needed worrying about. The first month at Apex Dynamics was the hardest kind of hard. Not dramatic, not crisis level, but the steady, grinding difficulty of learning a new system while being expected to run it at the same time. Marcus had known it would be this way. He'd known it the way he knew most things about difficulty, not from optimism or pessimism, but from a fairly accurate read of his own history, which told him that the beginning of anything real was never clean, that competence was something you built in increments, and the increments were often invisible while you were inside them. He'd known all of this, and it still wore on him in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. The project tracking system was the first thing. Apex Dynamics used a platform called Meridian, a project management and resource allocation tool that the company had migrated to 18 months ago, which meant that most of the staff had opinions about it that ranged from grudging acceptance to active hostility. Dennis had adapted to it and used it effectively. Celia used it because she had to and kept a parallel spreadsheet system that was, in Marcus's quiet assessment after 2 weeks, actually more useful than anything Meridian produced automatically. The field team leads, 3 of them, managing crews across the 4 active sites, had varying levels of engagement with it that correlated almost exactly with their age, which was the kind of pattern Marcus noted without judgment, because it was the kind of pattern that required management rather than correction. He spent the first 2 weeks reading, not just the project files, the whole operational history he had access to going back 18 months, site reports, budget reconciliations, client correspondence, the incident logs that documented what had gone wrong and when and who had been responsible for addressing it. He read the way he'd always read operational briefings, which was completely and without skipping, because the thing you skipped was almost always the thing that mattered later. By the 3rd week, he'd identified 4 problems. Not crises, nothing that was actively breaking, but the kind of structural issues that start small and compound over time until they become emergencies that everyone treats as surprises, even though the evidence was there all along. The Kellerman Bridge timeline was the most visible one, the one he'd flagged in his first 3 hours. But there was also a materials procurement pattern on the Harwick industrial site that was creating small but accumulating delays. A communication breakdown between the East team lead, a man named Garrett, who was excellent in the field and deeply resistant to administrative accountability, and the project management layer above him that was causing decisions to happen twice, once in the field and once in the office, with neither version fully matching the other. And a budget variance on the Harbor Reach project that the numbers described as minor, and that Marcus suspected, based on the specific pattern of how the variance was distributed across line items, was actually a misclassification problem rather than a spending problem, which were two very different things with two very different solutions. He wrote all four up in a memo. Not a long one page, tight, specific, with each problem described in a single paragraph that named the evidence, the likely trajectory if unaddressed, and a proposed direction rather than a fully formed solution, because he was 6 weeks in and didn't have enough context to be fully forming solutions yet. He put the memo on Victoria's desk on a Wednesday morning and went back to his work. She appeared in the operations area at 2 in the afternoon, memo in hand. "You've been here 6 weeks," she said. She was standing at the edge of the project wall, looking at the Kellerman site map. "Yes," Marcus said. "The Harwick procurement pattern. You got this from the site reports?" "The last 8 months of them," Marcus said. She looked at him. "Nobody read those reports?" she said. "I could tell," he said. "There was a formatting error in the month 6 report that carried forward into months 7 and 8. If anyone had read them consecutively, they would have caught it." Celia, who was at her desk nearby and clearly listening without appearing to listen, made a sound that could have been a cough. It wasn't a cough. "The budget variance on Harbor Reach," Victoria said. "Misclassification," Marcus said. "The materials cost is being logged under contingency rather than direct expenditure. It makes the contingency budget look depleted and the direct cost look clean. I don't think it's intentional. I think it's an artifact of how the project manager there learned to use Meridian. But it needs to be corrected before the quarterly review or the client's auditors are going to flag it, and it becomes a conversation nobody wants to have." Victoria was quiet for a moment, looking at the memo. Her left arm, the one that had been in the cast, now fully out of the brace as of 2 weeks ago, moved when she held things differently than the right one did, a slight compensatory shift in how she positioned her shoulder. It would probably resolve entirely with time. Or it wouldn't. Either way, she'd adapted to it without apparent distress. "How long will the Garrett situation take to address?" she said. "Depends on how Garrett responds to a direct conversation," Marcus said. "I haven't had it yet. I wanted to understand the full context before I went to him." "When are you having it?" "Friday," Marcus said. "I'm going to the East site Friday morning." "What's your approach?" Marcus thought about Garrett, 44, 18 years of field experience, the kind of expertise that made him genuinely hard to replace and that he was at least partially aware of, which was both the source of his value and the engine of his resistance. "I'm going to tell him what I observed and what it cost the project, and ask him how he'd fix it if he were in my position," Marcus said. "Either he has a good answer, in which case I learned something, or he doesn't, in which case he understands that I know the difference." Celia stopped pretending she wasn't listening. She turned around in her chair and looked at Marcus with an expression of moderate reassessment. "That's how I would do it," she said. She said it to Victoria, not to Marcus, which Marcus understood as its own kind of acknowledgement. Victoria put the memo on the project table. "I'll address the Harbor Reach issue with finance today," she said. "The rest is yours." She picked up her tablet. "Good work," she said, and walked out of the operations area and back toward whatever the next thing on her schedule was. Marcus looked at Celia. "She doesn't say that much," Celia said. "Say what?" "Good work," Celia said, and turned back to her desk. The Friday conversation with Garrett happened at the East Site, a bridge rehabilitation project in the city's industrial corridor, close enough to the water that you could smell it when the wind was right, far enough that the skyline was a distant arrangement of shapes rather than an immediate presence. Marcus arrived at 7 in the morning, which was 40 minutes before he told Garrett he was coming, because he wanted to see the site in its natural operating state rather than in the state it achieved when someone from the office was expected. What he saw told him several things. The crew was competent and worked well together. The kind of unit efficiency that only came from time and mutual trust, the kind Marcus recognized immediately because he'd spent years building it and years depending on it. The site was well organized in a way that reflected Garrett's influence. Materials staged intelligently, safety perimeter maintained, equipment in appropriate positions for the morning's work. Garrett himself was already there, wearing a hard hat with a crack in the brim that he'd clearly been meaning to replace for some time. Talking to one of his crew leads with the comfortable authority of a man who had been doing this longer than most of his crew had been old enough to hold a hard hat. Marcus watched for 20 minutes without announcing himself. Then he walked over. Garrett saw him coming. Something in his posture shifted. Not hostile exactly, but the slight bracing that people did when authority arrived unannounced. Then he saw that Marcus was 20 minutes early and recalibrated again, adjusting for the implication of that. "Mr. Reed," Garrett said. "Marcus," Marcus said. He'd told the field leads in his first week to use his first name. 3 of the 4 had started doing it. Garrett was still doing it the other way, which Marcus had noted without pushing. "You're early," Garrett said. "I wanted to see the site before we talked," Marcus said. "I hope that's okay." "It's your job to look at sites," Garrett said, not quite neutrally. "Yes," Marcus said, "and you run a good one. The crew staging is efficient. The perimeter is well maintained. Your crew lead on the south section, Martinez, he runs a tight team." Garrett studied him. He was trying to determine whether this was the softening up portion of a critique, the compliment before the but. Marcus watched him do it and waited. "What do you want to talk about?" Garrett said. "The reporting," Marcus said. "Specifically the gap between what happens on this site and what arrives in the Meridian system." There it was. Garrett's expression shifted into something more guarded. "I file the reports," he said. "You do," Marcus said, "but there's a consistent 3 to 4 day delay between field decisions and their documentation, which means by the time anyone in the office sees the status of a change, it's already been implemented and the window for input has closed. By the time anyone in the office processes anything, it's already been 4 days, Garrett said. He said it with the compressed frustration of someone who had been making this argument without traction for a long time. "I've got a bridge section that needs a call made today. I can't wait for a project manager to read a report and schedule a meeting to discuss it." "I know," Marcus said. Garrett paused. "You know?" "I've read your site reports going back 18 months, Marcus said. "I can see the pattern of the decisions and when they were made and how long the system took to respond when you tried to go through the system. You've been making field calls because the alternative was watching work stall while decisions moved through a process that wasn't fast enough for actual field conditions." He paused. "That's not a criticism. That's an accurate description of a system problem." Garrett was quiet for a moment. Around them, the morning work was proceeding. The sounds of the site, equipment and voices, and the particular rhythm of organized physical labor that Marcus had always found grounding in a way he couldn't entirely explain. "So what are you going to do about it?" Garrett said. "Not aggressively, genuinely." "I'm going to change the response time," Marcus said. "If you document a field decision in Meridian, same day, brief, doesn't have to be long, I'll respond within 4 hours during working hours. If it's a decision that needs my input before you make it, you call me directly and we decide it in the time it takes to have a phone conversation." Garrett looked at him steadily. "The last person in your role," he said, "didn't answer calls from field leads." "I know," Marcus said. "I read the call logs too." A pause. "You read the call logs," Garrett said flatly. "There's a lot in the system if you look at all of it," Marcus said. Garrett looked away toward the bridge section, the crew working. Something in him settled. Not dramatically, just the specific way a person settles when they've been waiting for a thing to be acknowledged, and it finally has been. "Same-day documentation and a 4-hour response," he said. "That's what you're offering." "That's what I'm committing to," Marcus said. "There's a difference." Garrett nodded once. It was the nod of someone who had heard promises from the office before and was choosing, provisionally, to test this one against the evidence rather than reject it on principle. What if the decision can't wait 4 hours, he said. Then you call me, Marcus said. I pick up. Garrett looked at him for a moment longer. Then he held out his hand. Marcus shook it. I'll file the Martinez section update this afternoon, Garrett said. You'll have it by 3. I'll respond by 5, Marcus said. Garrett almost smiled. You'll respond by 5, he repeated with the particular skepticism of someone practicing belief. He went back to his crew. Marcus stood at the edge of the site for a few minutes longer, looking at the bridge. It was mid-morning now, the light coming in at a low angle across the water, the city behind it in its patched and ongoing state. He thought about the first time he'd managed a team in the field. 23 years old, newly rated, 3 people depending on him to make calls that mattered, the ground feeling unstable in every direction. He thought about how long it had taken to learn that the most important part of the job was not the decision itself, but the environment in which the decision got made, the trust between the people making it. He put his hard hat on. He'd brought one from the site supply, proper ones not cracked at the brim, and went to look at the bridge up close. He was back in the office by noon. Victoria was on the phone in the glass-walled conference room on the east side of the 11th floor, standing rather than sitting, which he'd noticed was how she did long calls. She couldn't stay seated on a call that was either important or difficult, and she couldn't always tell in advance which it was going to be, so she stood for most of them. She saw him come in through the glass and held up one finger. A minute, and he went to his desk and started working through the morning's messages. The call ended 12 minutes later. She came out of the conference room and crossed to where he was. How was Garrett? She said, low enough that the question was between them. Good, Marcus said. He's been managing around a system problem, not creating one. We have an arrangement. What kind of arrangement? He told her briefly. She listened. He'll actually file same day, she said when he finished. He filed the Martinez update at 2:30, Marcus said. He turned his monitor slightly so she could see the Meridian notification. She looked at it. That's the first unprompted same-day update from that site in 11 months, she said. I know, Marcus said. I checked. She looked at him with the expression she sometimes had, the one he'd started to understand as genuine rather than strategic, the one that was processing something slightly beyond the professional. Can I ask you something? She said. Yeah. Why do you read everything? She said. I'm not criticizing it. I'm asking genuinely. Most people in your position would have been briefed and moved forward on the briefing. You read call logs, you read 18 months of site reports. Why? Marcus thought about how to answer this honestly, without it sounding like something it wasn't. Because briefings tell you what the person giving them thinks is important, he said. And sometimes the important thing is the thing nobody thought was important. She considered this. That's from the military. Everything useful I know is from somewhere, he said. Doesn't make it less true. She accepted this, the way she accepted most things he said, not immediately, but visibly, adding it to whatever picture she was building. Dinner Friday? She said. There's a client situation with the Harbor Reach developer that I need to brief you on, and I'd rather do it outside the office. She said this flatly and professionally, and he received it in exactly those terms. There's a place on Archer that has decent food and private enough tables. Friday works, Marcus said. She went back to her office. Marcus turned back to his monitor. Across the room, Celia was on a call, one hand pressed to her forehead with the expression of someone being told something inaccurate and trying to decide how to correct it without starting a confrontation. Dennis was at his desk eating a granola bar and typing simultaneously, which was a combination that seemed physically unlikely, but was apparently within his skill set. The operations area was its usual controlled noise, the background radiation of a group of people doing complicated work under reasonable pressure. Marcus worked until 6. He picked up Lily, who had been at Donna's again. A Tuesday-Thursday arrangement now, 2 days a week, which was manageable and which Donna seemed to genuinely prefer to not having, and drove home in the last of the day's light. Lily had made something in art class, a small ceramic dish that had been glazed a deep blue-green that she described as ocean-colored but not exactly ocean, and she held it in her lap the whole drive home with the care of someone transporting something irreplaceable. It cracked a little in the kiln, she said, showing him the hairline crack running across the base when they were inside. The art teacher said that sometimes happens. It's still good, Marcus said. I know, Lily said. I just wanted you to see it's not perfect. He put the dish on the kitchen windowsill, where the evening light came through and made the glaze do different things depending on the angle. He made dinner. He helped Lily with a worksheet about fractions that had been giving her difficulty, not by telling her the answers, but by asking her questions until she found them herself, which was a technique he'd spent 3 years developing and which she found maddening and effective in approximately equal measure. After she was asleep, he sat at the table with a cup of coffee and thought about Friday. Not with anxiety. Anxiety required uncertainty about the nature of the thing, and the nature of this was clear. Victoria Hale was his employer. They shared a history that was unusual and that had given their professional relationship a different texture than most, but the professional relationship was what it was, and Marcus was not a person who confused textures with structures. Still, he thought about it a little. The dinner at the place on Archer Street was not what he'd expected, which was itself not a surprise because the things he expected from Victoria rarely fully matched the actual Victoria. He'd expected the meeting to be primarily the Harbor Reach briefing, with conversation as the vehicle for it. What it was instead was primarily conversation, with the Harbor Reach situation addressed in 20 minutes over the first course and the remaining hour and a half something else entirely. Not romantics, dis. That word would have been inaccurate in a way that mattered. It was more like the specific quality of a conversation between two people who had been circling a genuine version of each other for 6 weeks in a professional context and were, for the first time, in a setting where the professional context wasn't doing all the structuring work. She told him about her father, Daniel Hale, who had built Apex Dynamics from a 4-person structural engineering firm in 1987 to the company it was now, and who had stepped back 2 years ago, not because he'd wanted to, but because his health had required it. A fact that she stated without self-pity or performance, in the same matter-of-fact register she used for most things, but with an undertone that Marcus recognized as the sound of someone carrying something heavy and having made peace with the weight of it. She was running the company because she was good at it, and because it was her family's work, and because her father needed to believe it was in capable hands, which were 3 different reasons, and she seemed equally clear about all 3. Did you always want to run it? Marcus asked. No, she said without hesitation. I wanted to be in the field. I have an engineering degree. I did site work for the first 4 years after school. I liked it. She looked at her water glass. I'm better at this than I would have been at that. I didn't know that at 23. I know it now. It doesn't mean it wasn't a loss. Marcus understood this. The thing you were better at not being the thing you'd wanted. When did you know? He said. Know what? That you were better at this. She thought about it. When I was 27, she said. There was a project, a hospital construction, the west side, complicated because of the site geology and the client's constantly shifting specifications, and 3 subcontractors who each thought the other 2 were incompetent, one of whom was correct. My father put me in charge of the client relationship. Within 3 weeks, the client had stopped calling him. She said this without pride, just the neutral recounting of evidence. I understood then that there was something I could do in a room full of people with conflicting interests that not everyone could do, and that it was more valuable to the company and to the projects than what I could do with a level in a set of site drawings. Do you miss it? Marcus said. Sometimes, she said. Mostly, I don't think about it. He nodded. What about you? She said. Miss the service? Yes. He didn't answer immediately because the immediate answer wasn't the accurate one. The immediate answer was no, which was the answer of the part of him that had spent the year after getting out trying to close the door on all of it, the loss and the damage and the specific loneliness of being a person shaped by a world that most people around you had never entered and would never understand. The accurate answer was more complicated. I miss the clarity of it, he said finally. In the field, in an operation, you know what you're doing and why and what success looks like. It's not simple, but it's clear. Civilian life has a lot of situations where success doesn't have a shape. He paused. I don't miss the rest of it enough to wish I'd stayed. What made you leave? She said. He looked at her. The restaurant was quiet enough around them that the question had room to be what it was. Lily, he said, partly. Her mother leaving made the question concrete. If I was going to be her only parent, I couldn't do it at the distance the service required. But also, he stopped, considered. I'd been in long enough that the thing I was good at was a specific kind of thing that I was less and less sure I wanted to keep being good at. He paused again. Does that make sense? Yes, Victoria said. She said it simply, without elaboration, in the way that meant she'd understood and wasn't going to dress the understanding up. They were quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of two people who have said enough real things that silence feels permitted rather than awkward. How's the brace? Marcus said. He nodded toward her arm. She flexed her hand slightly, a small test. Off in 2 weeks, the surgeon says. Probably 3, knowing how these things go. She looked at the arm briefly, with the neutral assessment of someone who has spent enough time dealing with a thing that it's become ordinary. It's strange, she said. I think about the 20 minutes, the ones you told me about. Don't, Marcus said. She looked at him. I'm serious, he said. I've been in situations where a few minutes in either direction made the difference. You can think about that for the rest of your life, or you can stop thinking about it. Thinking about it doesn't change it. I know, she said. I'm not catastrophizing. I'm more… She paused, choosing the word carefully. Grateful isn't the right word. Grateful feels too small for it. I just think about the fact that you stopped. She looked at him directly. You were in a dress shirt on your way to the most important interview you'd had in years. You heard a voice, and you stopped. I've told you, Marcus said. It wasn't a calculation. I know, she said. That's the part I think about. There was a silence that had weight in it, and Marcus let it have weight rather than filling it with something smaller. Around them, the restaurant conducted its evening business. The soft noise of other conversations, the movement of people, the ordinary busy life of a place that existed in the same city as collapsed buildings and fractured roads, and people making 2-second decisions in the middle of crises. The city that was still rebuilding, still working, still wearing its scars in some places, and its new skin in others. I want to tell you something, Victoria said. Okay? I didn't hire you because I owed you, she said. I know I've said a version of this before, but I want to say it completely. I investigated your background thoroughly before I came to your apartment. I spoke with your former unit contacts. Your commanding officer from your 3rd deployment spoke with me for 40 minutes. I looked at everything available. She set her fork down on the edge of her plate with the deliberateness of someone putting aside a distraction. What I found was someone who had spent 11 years building expertise that my company needs, and who had been unable to translate that expertise into civilian opportunity because civilian hiring is bad at reading non-traditional backgrounds. You would have been good at this job regardless of what happened in that debris field. Marcus looked at her. I just wanted you to know that, she said, because I think it matters that you know it. He was quiet for a moment. He thought about the 41 applications, the 4 months, the manila folder with the clear plastic cover from the drugstore on Henderson, the voice in the dark under the concrete that had redirected the whole arc of a morning he'd planned so carefully. Thank you, he said. You're welcome, she said, and picked her fork back up, and the conversation moved on to something else, and the evening continued. And when they left the restaurant, the city was doing what it always did at that hour. Its imperfect, ongoing, irreplaceable work of being. A place where people lived their complicated lives, one ordinary and extraordinary moment at a time. He drove home. Lily was with Donna for the evening. A Friday arrangement, Donna's idea, framed as a sleepover so Lily would experience it as something exciting rather than something functional, which was a piece of social intelligence from Donna that Marcus had been grateful for and had not tried to improve upon. He came into the apartment to its familiar quiet, the radiator knocking, the kitchen light left on the way he always left it. He sat at the table. He did not open his notebook. He thought about the shape of the past 7 weeks. From the morning of the earthquake to this specific Friday night, the arc of it, the way things that had seemed like losses had become not windfalls exactly, but different. Not easier, different. He thought about what Victoria had said, that she'd talked to his commanding officer for 40 minutes, that she'd investigated before she came, that she'd come to his apartment on the 9th day and stood in his hallway and told him she'd hired someone to find him, and what she'd found when she looked was someone the job already fit. He thought about Garrett saying that's the first unprompted same-day update in 11 months, and Celia turning around in her chair and making her non-cough sound. He thought about Lily holding the cracked ceramic dish in her lap on the drive home and saying, "I just wanted you to see it's not perfect." He got up and looked at the dish on the windowsill. The light was different now, at this hour, from a different angle, the city's ambient glow rather than the evening sun, and the glaze held it differently, a deeper color, the crack barely visible unless you knew where to look. He left the kitchen light on. He went to bed. 3 months after the earthquake, the city had developed 2 faces. The first face was the one you saw from a distance, the skyline restored to something close to its original arrangement, the cranes that had been visible for weeks now mostly gone, the main arterial roads cleared and repaved in the sections that had fractured worst. From a certain angle, at a certain hour, you could look at the city and not know anything significant had happened to it. The recovery had been real. The money and labor and organizational will that a city could mobilize when it needed to had mobilized, and the results were visible. The second face was the one you saw up close. The block on Merchant Street where the gas main had ruptured, now fully repaired but with a section of new asphalt that didn't quite match the old in color. A seam running across the road that the winter rain would work it gradually for years before it became invisible. The apartment buildings with their new facade materials that were structurally sound but architecturally mismatched, patches of different brick visible to anyone who knew where the damage had been. The people who had lost things that couldn't be repaired, businesses that hadn't reopened, apartments that hadn't been rebuilt in time to matter, the particular losses that don't appear in recovery statistics because the statistics measure what was fixed and not what was left behind. Marcus moved through both faces of the city every day and understood them both, which was a kind of literacy he'd developed not from this earthquake, but from years of moving through places that were trying to put themselves back together in the wake of things that had broken them. He'd learned a long time ago that recovery was never a single story. It was always a collection of individual stories at different stages, some of them going well and some of them going badly, and most of them going somewhere in between, in the specific and irreducible way that human situations always went. His own situation had become, by any honest accounting, something he could not have described 3 months ago without sounding like a man narrating a future he didn't actually believe in. The Kellerman Bridge timeline had been renegotiated with the client in the 2nd month, a conversation that Marcus had prepared for more carefully than almost anything he'd prepared for at Apex Dynamics so far, because renegotiating a timeline with a client who had built their own plans around your original commitment required a specific kind of honesty that most people in the room were going to resist having. He'd presented the actual data, the crew capacity, the weather window, the materials lead time, the realistic productivity rate on a bridge rehabilitation of this scope. He'd shown the client the original timeline against the evidence and explained, without hedging, why they diverged. He'd proposed a revised timeline that was achievable and explained why achievable mattered more than optimistic, which was a distinction clients sometimes needed to hear 3 times before it landed. The client had not been happy. One of the 3 people in the room from the client side had been actively hostile for about 20 minutes, which Marcus had absorbed without either capitulating or escalating, just holding the position that the numbers were the numbers, and the numbers didn't change based on the temperature in the room. Eventually, the hostility had found nowhere to go and subsided, and the revised timeline had been signed. Celia, on the drive back, had said, "Where did you learn to sit still in a room like that?" 11 years of situations where the other option was worse, Marcus said. She'd nodded, in the way she nodded when she was filing something as confirmed rather than as new information. The Harbor Reach budget issue had been corrected without the client's auditors ever seeing it, which was the best possible outcome. The Harwick materials procurement pattern had been addressed through a conversation with the site PM that was shorter and less complicated than Marcus had anticipated, because the problem turned out to be a misunderstanding of the procurement system's lead time calculation rather than anything more structural. A 15-minute fix that had been compounding for 4 months, because nobody had read the site reports consecutively and caught the pattern. Garrett had filed same-day updates on 16 consecutive site days. Marcus knew the number because he'd counted, not obsessively, but in the way he tracked things that told him whether a system was working. On the 17th day, Garrett had called him directly at 7 in the morning about a foundation anomaly that needed a structural engineer on site within 4 hours. Marcus had gotten the engineer there in 3. Garrett had never once called him anything other than Mr. Reed, but he'd stopped saying it with the specific inflection that meant Mr. Reed, the office person, and started saying it with the inflection that just meant Marcus. Dennis had, somewhere in the second month, started treating Marcus as a peer rather than a supervisor, which was a more useful dynamic than the alternative, in which Marcus had deliberately encouraged. Dennis knew the company's systems in a way Marcus was still catching up to, and pretending otherwise would have been a waste of both their time. The 90 days that Celia had been given before forming Fixed Opinions arrived on a Thursday. She did not mark it publicly. But she stopped going to Victoria with operational questions that fell within Marcus's domain, which was how Celia communicated things she had decided. The new apartment was in the Linden Heights neighborhood, not dramatically different from Whitmore in terms of the city's geography, but different in the specific ways that mattered to daily life. Wider sidewalks, a park 3 blocks away with an actual grass surface rather than the patchy municipal effort that Whitmore's park offered. A grocery store within walking distance that stocked the brand of Lily's cereal, which the Whitmore store had never carried and which had required a separate trip every 2 weeks to a store in a different direction. The school district was the same. Lily stayed at Carlisle, but the commute was 8 minutes shorter, which was 8 minutes that existed somewhere else in the day now. The apartment itself was 3 bedrooms, which meant Lily had her own room and Marcus had his, and there was a third one that he'd set up as a workspace, a desk, a bookshelf that he was gradually populating, the project maps he sometimes brought home when he needed to think through something without the office around him. The kitchen had a cabinet door that closed properly. He hadn't replaced the blue mug with the superglued handle. It had come with them, packed carefully in a dish towel, and it sat in the new cabinet above the new coffee maker, still slightly chipped at the rim, still holding coffee exactly as well as it always had. Lily had spent the first week in the new apartment doing what she did in new spaces, moving through it methodically, testing each room, determining its character, establishing the specific arrangement of her things that meant she had claimed it. She'd put the cracked ceramic dish on the windowsill of her bedroom, where the morning light came through. Marcus had noticed this and not mentioned it. Some things didn't need to be mentioned. "I like it better," she said, on the 7th day. "Yeah?" Marcus said. "The park," she said. "And the ceiling in my room is higher. It makes it feel bigger even though it's the same size." "Ceilings do that," Marcus said. She considered this. "How do you know things like that?" she said. "What things?" "Like structural things. How ceilings make rooms feel." "You spend enough time in enough different kinds of spaces," Marcus said. "You start to notice." She thought about this in the way she thought about things that she wasn't going to ask about right now, but was filing for later. Then she went back to whatever she'd been doing, which was arranging her bookshelf by a system that remained opaque to him, despite 2 attempts to understand it. So, he saw Victoria outside the office for the 3rd time on a Saturday in November, 8 weeks after the dinner on Archer Street, when he happened to be at the farmer's market on Crescent with Lily. Lily's idea, the farmer's market, a recent interest she'd developed that Marcus suspected had something to do with a school project about food systems, but which she'd adopted with enough genuine enthusiasm that the origin no longer seemed to matter. He was standing at a vegetable stand trying to figure out what variety of squash he was holding when he heard Lily say, "Oh," with a specific quality that made him look up. Victoria was standing 5 feet away with a canvas bag over her shoulder. No cast, no brace, the left arm moving with the same easy range as the right. She was wearing a jacket he hadn't seen before and no professional bearing whatsoever, which made her look different in a way he registered without immediately categorizing. She was looking at Lily with an expression of mild surprise. "Hi," Lily said, with the directness of someone who saw no reason not to proceed. "You're the lady with the broken arm." "I was," Victoria said. "It's better now." "My dad fixed it," Lily said. Marcus put the squash down. That's not exactly how it worked, he said. He got it unstuck, Lily said, which was her version, and she was sticking to it. Victoria looked at Marcus. Something in her expression was doing the almost smile thing, which he'd come to recognize as the version that appeared when something had surprised her in a way she found worth acknowledging. This is Lily, he said unnecessarily. I figured, Victoria said. Lily was assessing Victoria with the same steady, unsentimental evaluation she applied to everything that seemed potentially important. Do you like squash? She said. Depends on the preparation, Victoria said. That's what my dad says, Lily said. He says the right answer to most food questions is depends on the preparation. She looked at Marcus. You can get it. I'll come find you. And she moved off toward the next stand, which had a display of apples in a color arrangement that had apparently caught her attention. Marcus and Victoria stood in the middle of the farmer's market in the November light, which was the particular clear cold light of late autumn, in a city that was, today, just going about its business. She's something, Victoria said. She is, Marcus said. She looks like you. Everyone says she looks like her mother, Marcus said. Maybe they're both right, Victoria said. They walked together through the market, not by plan, just by the geometry of two people moving in the same direction without reason to do otherwise. Lily reappeared periodically, deposited things in Marcus's bag with the efficiency of someone who had a list she was working through, evaluated Victoria twice more with glances that she thought were subtle and were not, and disappeared again. Victoria bought coffee from a stand near the east end and held it with both hands, the left as easily as the right. And Marcus noted the absence of the brace with the specific satisfaction of someone for whom that detail had weight. How's your father? Marcus asked, because he'd met Daniel Hales 6 weeks ago when the older man had come into the office for what was apparently a monthly visit, a ritual he'd maintained since stepping back. And Marcus had found him sitting in the operations area looking at the project wall with an expression that contained in equal parts pride and the specific difficulty of watching something you built continue without you. Better than he was, Victoria said. Worse than he wants to be. About what you'd expect. She looked at her coffee. He asked about you after you met. He said you reminded him of a site foreman he had in 1994 who he described as the best hire of his career. What happened to the foreman? Marcus said. Retired in 2011 after 23 years with the company, Victoria said. Still sends a card at the new year. She paused. My father doesn't compare people to Thomas Okafor lightly. I'll try not to let him down, Marcus said. You're not going to let him down, Victoria said, with the flat certainty she brought to things she'd already decided. Lily came back with 2 apples and a small container of honey and the information that there was a stand selling handmade dog leashes that she found interesting, just in general, and that it would be weird to go look at them alone. Marcus paid for the apples and the honey and followed her to the leash stand, and Victoria came too, and Lily described the craftsmanship of the leashes to them with an authority she'd assembled in approximately 2 minutes of observation, and Marcus stood there in the November morning listening to his daughter and watching the city go by around him, and felt something that he'd felt very rarely in his adult life, and that he had no single word for. Not happiness exactly, not contentment, not relief, though it contained elements of all three. It was more like the feeling of a load that had been distributed properly, weight in the right places, balance achieved not through perfection, but through the slow and imperfect work of finding where things actually fit. Later, when Lily was choosing which honey to take home, and Victoria had stepped away to take a call, Marcus stood at the edge of the market and looked at the city around him. Not the skyline, not the version of it that was recovered and composed. Just the street level. The people, the stalls, the particular disorder of a public space working exactly as it was supposed to work, which was imperfectly and completely. He thought about the morning of the earthquake. He did this sometimes, not obsessively, not with either regret or the false satisfaction of a narrative that had resolved cleanly. He thought about it honestly, the way you think about the things that bent your life in a direction you didn't choose. He'd been 7 minutes from the building. He'd heard a voice. He'd stood at the edge of a debris field for 2 seconds and then crossed the street. He hadn't known what it would cost him that morning. He hadn't known what it would return to him either. He'd just known what he couldn't not do. That was the thing about the decision that people, when he tried to explain it, wanted to make into something it wasn't. They wanted it to be sacrifice, the conscious and noble variety. The man who gives up his future for a stranger and is rewarded for his virtue. That version was cleaner and more satisfying and entirely wrong. It hadn't been a sacrifice in the intentional sense. It hadn't been a calculation about reward. It had been something simpler and harder to articulate. The fact that some people, when they hear a voice in the dark, cannot keep walking. Not because they are heroes, because they are who they are, and who they are doesn't permit the alternative. Marcus had spent years being ambivalent about who he was, about the things the service had made him good at and what that goodness had cost in other directions, about the kind of father he'd been in the worst year and the kind he was trying to be now, about the gap between the version of himself that he could articulate and the version that showed up in actual circumstances, under actual pressure, when the dress shirt was on and the folder was under his arm and the ground was moving. What the earthquake had given him, in the end, was not a job and not a salary, and not even the specific gift of Victoria Hale walking into his apartment 9 days later with a cast on her arm and a complicated expression and the willingness to say clearly what she meant. What it had given him was a data point, a single, specific, unambiguous piece of evidence about who he was when the structure was removed and only the person remained. He was the person who crossed the street, not perfect, not consistent across all dimensions, not immune to the bad years or the bad decisions or the slow accumulation of ordinary failures that constituted a human life. But in the specific circumstance where it mattered most, the one with no witnesses, no benefit, no time to think, he had been exactly who he hoped he was. And that was something he could put down somewhere solid and build on. In December, 3 months and 17 days after the earthquake, Lily came into the kitchen on a Saturday morning with the ceramic dish in her hands, the one she'd made in art class, ocean-colored but not exactly ocean, cracked along the base where the kiln had been too hot or the clay too dense, or whatever the precise physics of it had been. "I want to put this in the kitchen," she said. "The light is better in here in the morning." Marcus moved the blue mug slightly on the windowsill to make room. Lily set the dish beside it, adjusted it twice, stepped back to look. The crack was still there. It would always be there, see? That wasn't the kind of thing that healed. The dish held its shape anyway, the glaze doing what the glaze did in the morning light, color shifting between blue and green depending on the angle. "Better?" Marcus said. "Better," Lily said, with the certainty of someone who had made a final decision. She went to make her oatmeal. Marcus poured his coffee into the chipped blue mug and stood at the counter and drank it. Looking at the two objects on the windowsill, the mug he'd repaired and the dish she'd made, and the crack in it that no one had repaired because it didn't need to be, because the thing was whole enough to serve its purpose, and the mark of what it had survived was part of it now, as permanent and irrelevant as a scar on a hand that worked fine. He drank his coffee. The city was out there, doing what it did. Its vast, imperfect, ongoing work of being a place where people lived, where things broke and were rebuilt, where voices called out from debris fields, and sometimes someone was close enough and present enough to hear. The park was 3 blocks away. Carlisle Elementary was 6. The Apex Dynamics building was 22 minutes by car in morning traffic, 14 on a clear Saturday. It was a Saturday. "Daddy?" Lily said from the table. "Are you just going to stand there?" "For a minute," Marcus said. She accepted this. She ate her oatmeal. The banana was cut into circles. Outside, the city moved through its morning. Inside, the kitchen was warm and ordinary and full of the specific evidence of a life that had been put together carefully, over time, from pieces that didn't always fit and had been made to fit anyway through the slow and unspectacular work of showing up every day and doing what needed doing. Marcus finished his coffee. He put the mug back on the windowsill. He went to the table and sat down across from his daughter, and the morning continued. Some things don't resolve into lessons, not clean ones you can write down and carry around and apply to the next situation. Some things just become part of the shape of a person. The morning they crossed the street instead of walking past, the voice they stopped for, the version of themselves they discovered they were when it mattered. The weight of it doesn't go away. It just becomes familiar. It becomes something you carry without noticing, the way you carry everything that's really yours. Not dramatically, not consciously, just in the ordinary forward motion of a life that keeps moving even after the ground stops shaking. Marcus Reed had crossed a street on a Tuesday morning in September, in a city he lived in, on the way to an appointment he didn't make. Everything else followed from that. Not because the world was fair, or because good acts were reliably rewarded, or because the universe had a system for returning what it took. It followed because of one specific woman who had been looking for him for 9 days, and because of what she'd found when she looked, and because of what Marcus had already been before any of it happened. Before the earthquake, before the interview, before the morning he pulled on his blue shirt and straightened his imperfect tie and told his daughter that their hard days might be almost over. He'd been the man who crossed the street long before he crossed it. The earthquake just made it visible.